right, everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Always ready to dive in.
Awesome. Today we're tackling something called Zero Trust Privileged Access, or ZTPA for short.
Definitely a hot topic these days.
You got that right. Our listeners sent in some excerpts from, well, actually quite a long document.
Sounds like we've got our work cut out for us.
Yeah, but it's a good challenge, right? We're going to unpack all this and figure out exactly what ZTPA is all about and why everyone's making such a fuss about it.
I'm all for it. Let's break it down.
Okay, so imagine this. A hacker, right, gets their hands on an employee's login. Bad news, usually.
Pretty much game over in a lot of systems.
But with ZTPA, it's a different story. ZTPA basically says, nope, not so fast. It throws that old trust but verify idea right out the window.
Trust but verify just doesn't cut it in today's world.
Definitely not. So, to kick things off, can you give us a clear definition of zero trust? What's the core concept here?
Sure. Zero trust completely flips the script on traditional security. It assumes that nobody, and I mean nobody, inside or outside the network, is automatically trustworthy.
No more assuming everything's safe within those network walls.
Exactly. Instead, it demands constant verification for every single user and device trying to access any resources.
So even if you've already proven yourself once, you've got to keep proving it over and over again.
Think of it like airport security. You go through one checkpoint, then another, then another.
Even if you've just shown your ID and boarding pass.
Yep, pretty much. Every single door, every single access point. Always verifying.
Got it. Always verify. But why is this never trust, always verify approach so important? Especially when we're talking about this thing called privileged access?
Yes, privileged access. This is where it gets really interesting. Privileged access refers to accounts, often those used by IT administrators, that have, let's say, special permissions within a system.
So like the VIPs of the network.
Exactly. They have the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. With the old way of doing security, if someone got hold of those credentials, well, it'd be a disaster.
Like giving someone the master key to your house.
And a map of where you keep all the valuables.
Not good.
Not good at all. The damage could be massive.
So it's not just about keeping the bad guys out. It's about limiting the damage, even if someone inside, goes rogue. Or if the credentials get stolen somehow.
Absolutely. That's the whole point. Limit the blast radius, so to speak.
Okay, that makes sense. But wouldn't all this constant verifying be a pain for employees? I mean, imagine having to jump through hoops just to open a file or send an email.
That's a common concern, but ZTPA is actually more strategic than that. It's not about making life difficult for everyone. It's about finding that balance, security versus usability.
So how does it find that balance?
Well, one way is by minimizing what we call the attack surface. Think of your network as a castle. All the doors, windows, tunnels, those are potential entry points for attackers.
Okay, I get the picture. The attack surface is basically all the weak spots.
Exactly. ZTPA is all about reducing those weak spots, making it much, much harder for attackers to get in, even if they've managed to snag some credentials.
So shrink the target, make it tougher to hit. Got it. But how does ZTPA actually make that happen? How do you shrink that attack surface?
One of the most important principles is something called least privilege. It means that users only get access to the stuff they absolutely need for their specific job.
So no more giving everyone access to everything just in case.
Exactly. If you need a hammer, you get a hammer, not the whole toolbox.
Right. Makes sense. But what about the people who do need those higher level permissions, like those IT admins we were talking about?
Good point. That's where just-in-time access comes into play. Instead of giving them permanent admin rights, it's more like checking out those rights, only when they're needed and for a limited time.
So like a library book. You borrow it, use it, then return it.
You got it. It's all about minimizing the risk. If those admin rights aren't just sitting there all the time, it's much harder for an attacker to exploit them.
Makes sense. But what about those insider threats? The disgruntled employee or someone who makes a mistake. How does ZTPA deal with that human element?
Well, ZTPA recognizes that threats can come from inside too. It's not just about external attackers. That's why it really emphasizes monitoring all user activity, especially those with those privileged accounts.
So it's like having a watchful eye over everything that's happening.
Exactly. It's about having a detailed record of who accessed what and when. This not only helps to deter anyone with bad intentions, but it also provides a clear audit trail if something does go wrong.
Like a digital detective.
You could say that, always gathering evidence, just in case.
I see. But all this monitoring, doesn't that feel a bit, Big Brother-ish, like someone's always looking over your shoulder?
I understand that concern. ZTPA isn't about creating a culture of distrust or micromanaging every little thing. It's about having safeguards that make sense given the risks.
So how do you strike that balance? Security without making everyone feel like they're being spied on.
Transparency and communication are key. Employees need to understand why these measures are in place. It's not about monitoring their every move. It's about protecting everyone, the whole organization, from potential threats.
Right, so it's a shared responsibility. Everyone's on the same team.
Yeah.
But let's talk practical steps. What are the concrete things an organization needs to do to get ZTPA up and running?
It's a multi-step process, that's for sure. First things first, you need a really good understanding of your current security situation. What are the most important assets you need to protect? Where are the weaknesses?
So do a thorough security checkup before diving in.
Exactly. Once you have a clear picture of your vulnerabilities, you can tailor a ZTPA strategy that fits your specific needs. It's not one size fits all.
Got it. Assess, then strategize. What comes next?
Well, we've talked about least privilege, right? That needs to be enforced. Review every single access right and get rid of any permissions that aren't absolutely necessary.
So trim the fat, so to speak.
Exactly. And then there's multi-factor authentication, or MFA as we call it. That's a must-have.
Extra layer of security.
Right. Like adding a deadbolt to your door. It makes it much harder for attackers to get in, even if they've managed to steal a password.
MFA. Check. What else?
Continuous monitoring is essential. You need systems that are always on the lookout for any suspicious activity. Think of it like a security camera that's always recording, logging every access attempt, and flagging anything that looks out of place.
Always watching, always analyzing.
Precisely. And last but not least, automation. By automating things like access requests, approvals, and revocations, you can really streamline the whole process and reduce the risk of human error. Computers are much better at following those strict rules than we are.
Makes sense. Less room for mistakes. So lots of moving parts, lots of technology involved in ZTPA. Out of all of those steps, which one do you think is the absolute most crucial for ZTPA to really work?
Tough question. They're all important, but if I had to pick one, I'd say enforcing the principle of least privilege access is the cornerstone. It's the foundation upon which everything else is built. By limiting access to only what's absolutely necessary, you dramatically reduce the potential damage, even if an account is compromised.
Least privilege. Got it. But how do you actually put that into practice without making everyone's lives miserable? You know, that balance between security and user experience again.
Finding that balance is key. It takes careful planning, communication, and a willingness to adapt. You might, for example, set up a system where users can request temporary elevated privileges when they need them, and those requests would go through an approval process and automatically expire after a certain time. The idea is to make the security measures as invisible and painless as possible while still providing that critical protection.
Okay, so security without the headaches. Sounds ideal. You mentioned earlier that zero trust is more than just a bunch of tools and technologies. It's a whole new way of thinking about security. Can you expand on that a bit?
Absolutely. Zero trust represents a fundamental shift from that old perimeter-based model. It acknowledges that threats can come from anywhere, not just from outside the network.
So no more assuming everything inside the walls is safe.
Right. We have to acknowledge that threats can come from within the organization, too. It's about constantly questioning, verifying, and never taking anything for granted.
So kind of like being a detective, always looking for clues and never assuming anything.
Precisely. And that's what makes it so powerful. It's a proactive and dynamic approach to security, constantly adapting to evolving threats.
It sounds like a pretty big change in mindset. But how do you get an entire organization to adopt this always-on security approach?
Cultural adoption is crucial. It's not just about implementing new tech, it's about changing behaviors, attitudes, and the entire organizational culture itself. This means training programs to educate employees about the importance of zero trust and making it clear that security is everyone's responsibility. It also means establishing clear policies and procedures that align with zero trust principles and making sure they're consistently enforced.
So it's about creating a culture of security awareness where everyone's on board and understands the stakes. But what's the bottom line here? What benefits can organizations expect to see by adopting this zero trust approach?
Well, the benefits are significant. First and foremost, it significantly reduces the risk of data breaches and cyber attacks. This can lead to lower insurance premiums and fewer regulatory fines, which is always a good thing. But beyond the financial benefits, Zero Trust also strengthens the overall security posture of an organization, making it more resilient and adaptable to new and evolving threats.
So it's not just about preventing bad things from happening, it's about building a stronger, more adaptable security framework.
You got it. It's about being proactive, not reactive. And that's essential in today's ever-changing threat landscape.
I can definitely see the appeal. As an expert in this field, what do you find most fascinating about this whole zero trust concept? What gets you excited about it?
What excites me most is its potential to transform not just cybersecurity, but also how we think about trust in general. It's a philosophy that encourages critical thinking, skepticism, and a more discerning approach to evaluating information and making decisions. It's about being more intentional about where we place our trust.
Okay, now you're really getting me thinking. You're saying zero trust has implications beyond just protecting our computers and networks.
Absolutely. Think about it. The core principle of zero trust, never trust, always verify, can be applied to so many other areas of our lives. From personal relationships and business transactions to evaluating information online, this mindset encourages a healthy skepticism and a more critical approach to decision-making.
So it's about being more discerning, more careful about what we believe and who we trust. And maybe that's something we could all benefit from, not just in the digital world, but in our everyday lives as well.
Exactly. It's about taking a more conscious and deliberate approach to trust, recognizing that it's something that needs to be earned and maintained, not just blindly given.
That's a really powerful idea. And it makes me wonder, how might this zero trust mindset change the way we interact with the world around us? How might it influence our relationships, our decision-making, and even our perception of reality itself?
Those are profound questions and ones that I think we'll continue to grapple with as zero trust becomes more prevalent in our lives.
It's definitely a lot to think about. We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into zero trust privileged access. We've explored its principles, benefits, and even its broader philosophical implications. But before we move on to even more fascinating aspects of this topic, let's take a quick break to let all this information sink in.
Sounds good. I'm ready for a coffee refill.
Me too. We'll be back in a few minutes to explore how zero trust is being put into practice in the real world. Stay tuned.
Welcome back. Glad to have you with us again for more on zero trust.
Yeah, we're getting into the really interesting stuff now. Right before the break, we were talking about how to actually implement zero trust privileged access. You mentioned multi-factor authentication, which seems pretty standard these days. But what about other tools? What else can organizations use to make ZTPA a reality?
Well, think of ZTPA as a toolbox, right? MFA is definitely one of those essential tools, but there are others like Identity and Access Management Solutions, IAM for short.
Okay, IAM. And what do those do?
They're kind of like the control center for access. They decide who gets access to what based on their roles and permissions.
So like a really strict bouncer at a club, checking everyone's ID, making sure they're on the list.
That's a great analogy. And that bouncer is working 24/7, constantly verifying identities and making sure everyone is following those least privilege rules.
Right, right. Least privilege, we talked about that.
Mm.
So IAM is like the brains of the operation. What else is in that ZTPA toolbox?
Another crucial one is Security Information and Event Management, or SIEM.
SIEM. Okay, another acronym to remember. What's that all about?
Think of SIEM as your security guard, constantly watching the surveillance cameras. It's all about monitoring, collecting, and analyzing all those security logs from across your network.
So it's looking for anything suspicious, any signs of trouble.
Exactly. And it does all this in real time, so you can react quickly if something's going down.
I see. So we've got MFA, IMM, SIEM. Sounds like a lot of moving parts. How does an organization even know where to start with all this? It seems pretty overwhelming.
It can be complex, that's for sure, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach to ZTPA. It's a journey, not a quick fix. The key is to start by really understanding your organization's specific risks and needs. What are the crown jewels, so to speak? What needs the most protection?
So assess the situation before jumping into solutions.
Exactly. You need to know where your vulnerabilities are before you can start building those defenses.
Makes sense. But once you have a plan in place, a strategy, how do you know if it's actually working?
Wow.
How do you measure the success of ZTPA?
That's where continuous monitoring comes in. ZTPA isn't something you set up and then forget about. It needs constant attention, ongoing adjustments and improvements.
You're always keeping an eye on things, looking for any cracks in the armor.
Right, and being ready to adapt. The threat landscape is constantly changing, so your security strategy needs to be flexible enough to keep up.
Okay, so ZTPA is a long-term commitment, not a one-time fix. Got it. But let's switch gears for a moment and talk about compliance. You mentioned earlier that ZTPA can help organizations meet regulatory requirements. Can you give some examples of how that works in the real world?
Sure. Think about the healthcare industry, for instance. They handle incredibly sensitive data patient information, and there are strict regulations like IPA to protect that data.
IPA, right. So how does ZTPA fit in there?
Well, ZTPA aligns really well with IPA's requirements for access control, data encryption, and audit trails. By implementing ZTPA, healthcare organizations can show they're serious about protecting patient privacy and meeting those regulatory requirements.
So it's not just about checking boxes for compliance. It's actually building a security framework that's in line with those regulations. That's pretty smart.
Yeah.
But what about other industries? Is ZTPA applicable across the board?
Absolutely. ZTPA is flexible enough to be tailored to just about any industry. Let's take the financial sector, for example. Security breaches there can be catastrophic, right?
Massive financial losses, reputational damage, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. So in that case, ZTPA can be implemented to protect all those sensitive financial transactions and customer data, helping them meet those strict requirements of PCI DSS.
Right, PCI DSS, another one of those important regulations. So it sounds like ZTPA is kind of a chameleon. It can adapt to the specific needs of different environments.
You could say that. It's all about finding the right tools and strategies for the specific risks and challenges that each industry faces.
Okay, so ZTPA is adaptable, it's compliance-friendly. But zooming out a bit, what about the bigger picture? How do you see zero trust shaping the future of cybersecurity in general?
Well, I think it's more than just a passing trend. It's a fundamental shift in how we approach security, and its impact is only going to grow in the years to come. We're already seeing zero trust principles applied beyond traditional IT networks, you know? It's expanding into cloud environments, mobile devices, even the Internet of Things.
So zero trust is breaking free from those traditional network boundaries.
Exactly. It's moving into all these new digital spaces.
Which makes sense, right? Everything's becoming so interconnected these days.
Yeah, it's all connected. But what about as humans? How will zero trust affect the way we work and interact with technology in the future? It'll definitely change how we work, that's for sure. We're all going to have to be more security conscious in everything we do online. Think stronger passwords, being more careful about what links we click, really scrutinizing the information we see online.
So it's like zero trust is pushing us towards a more vigilant and security-aware digital culture.
I think that's a good way to put it. We can't just assume things are safe anymore. We have to be proactive and take responsibility for our own digital security.
Right, no more blindly trusting. But with any big shift, there are always challenges. What do you see as the biggest obstacles to widespread adoption of zero trust?
Well, one of the biggest hurdles is inertia. A lot of organizations are stuck in their old ways of doing things, clinging to those outdated perimeter-based security models. They're reluctant to make the big changes that zero trust requires.
So it's about breaking free from old habits, which can be tough, especially for large organizations.
It definitely takes commitment. And then there's the complexity issue. Implementing ZTPA can be pretty daunting. It requires significant investments in technology, training, and overhauling those old processes. It's a journey, not a sprint.
Yeah, it's a whole new way of thinking about security. But what about us everyday users? What can we do to adopt a zero trust mindset in our own lives?
It starts with awareness. Learn about zero trust, understand the risks out there, and be careful about what you share online. Think critically about everything you see on the internet and don't just take things at face value. And honestly, it's okay to be a little paranoid these days when it comes to your digital security. Better safe than sorry, right?
Right. Always question, always verify. But beyond those individual actions, what role do you see governments and policymakers playing in this whole zero trust movement?
Well, they have a big role to play, that's for sure. They can help create a more secure digital environment for everyone.
How so?
Well, they can enact laws and regulations that encourage or even mandate stronger security practices. Think data protection standards, promoting multi-factor authentication, incentivizing organizations to really step up their cybersecurity game.
So kind of setting the bar higher for everyone when it comes to security.
Exactly. It's about creating a regulatory landscape that prioritizes cybersecurity and pushes organizations to adopt those best practices.
Right. So everyone's playing their part.
Yeah.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. from the technical nuts and bolts of ZTPA to its broader impact on society. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one last thought-provoking question to consider. So if zero trust is all about, eliminating implicit trust and verifying everything, how could that idea, that concept, extend beyond just technology and computers? Could it actually change how we approach trust in other parts of our lives, like in our relationships, or even just making everyday decisions?
That's a really interesting question, and it's one that honestly deserves a lot more thought than we probably have time for today. But yeah, I think the implications of zero trust do go way beyond just cybersecurity. They really get to the heart of human behavior, how we interact with each other, and how we see the world.
It's almost like zero trust is pushing us to be more critical thinkers, more careful about what we believe, not just online, but in every aspect of our lives.
Exactly. I mean, we're bombarded with information all the time, from all directions. It's getting harder and harder to know what's true, what's real. And zero trust can help us navigate that. It gives us a framework for evaluating information, for questioning assumptions, and for being more discerning about what we choose to believe.
So it's about being more intentional about where we place our trust, not just blindly accepting things, but actually looking for evidence, verifying, and making sure things add up. But how do we balance that healthy skepticism with, the need for trust in our personal relationships? We can't just go around questioning everyone we meet, can we?
Of course not. It's not about being suspicious of everyone or assuming everyone's out to get you. It's more about being aware, being mindful. Zero trust doesn't mean you can't have close relationships. It just means you're more conscious of the trust you place in others.
So you're saying trust is something that needs to be earned, not just automatically given.
Exactly. Trust is built over time through shared experiences and consistent actions. It's not a static thing, it's a process. And zero trust encourages us to be more active participants in that process.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about recognizing that trust can also be broken. And maybe zero trust gives us the tools to reevaluate our relationships, to set boundaries and protect ourselves if needed.
Exactly. It's about empowering ourselves to make informed decisions about who and what we trust. And ultimately, that leads to stronger, healthier relationships and a more fulfilling life.
Wow, we've really gone deep here today. From the technical details of zero trust privileged access to these really profound questions about trust and human nature. It's clear that zero trust is more than just a cybersecurity concept. It's a philosophy, a way of thinking that can impact every aspect of our lives.
I couldn't agree more. It's about being more discerning, more critical in our thinking, and more intentional about the choices we make, both online and offline.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into zero trust privileged access. We've covered a lot of ground today, and I hope our listeners have come away with a deeper understanding of this complex but incredibly important topic.
It's been a pleasure sharing these insights with you and our listeners.
The pleasure was all ours. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of zero trust. Remember, stay curious, stay vigilant, and never stop questioning the world around you. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.